For decades, fans of classic Hollywood have speculated about what really went on behind the scenes of some of the biggest films of the 20th century. Among those whispers was a persistent curiosity. Why did James Garner and Charles Bronson, two titans of their era, never appear close, despite starring in the same blockbuster films? And why did Garner remain tight-lipped about Bronson for so long? That silence, thick with tension and questions, has finally cracked open. What Garner finally shared wasn't just gossip. It was a revelation. James Garner wasn't known for Hollywood drama. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he kept things private, reserved, and professional. But in rare interviews and later in his memoirs, he began to peel back the curtain. And when it came to Charles Bronson, he didn't hold back. What he revealed was far from what fans expected of two leading men who once lit up the screen together. It wasn't rivalry. It wasn't competition. It was personal. Garner described Bronson not with admiration or brotherly fondness, but with a surprising level of frustration. According to Garner, Bronson was difficult, cold, and even combative behind the scenes. Not someone misunderstood or quietly intense, but someone Garner openly called a pain in the ***. Strong words, especially coming from someone known for diplomacy. This first glimpse into the truth wasn't just about airing grievances. It painted a more complete picture of the off-camera reality. While audiences saw a group of tough, talented actors pulling off a legendary breakout in The Great Escape, behind the scenes, the vibe was far less harmonious. The camaraderie? It wasn't always real. And for Garner, the silence he kept for so long was likely out of respect for the film, the legacy, and perhaps even for Bronson himself. But years later, when that silence was broken, it wasn't out of bitterness. It was out of honesty. Garner wanted fans to know the truth, unfiltered and raw. Not for headlines, but because the myth of perfect on-set unity simply wasn't accurate. And for a man who valued truth over polish, that mattered. What makes this revelation even more compelling is how it reframes how we view both men. It's easy to assume stars of that caliber got along, shared laughs between takes, bonded over fame. But sometimes, even legends clash. And when they do, the fallout lingers long after the cameras stop rolling. But that tension didn't start and end on a single set. In fact, what unfolded between Garner and Bronson stretched across decades, shaped by ego, conflict, and the very different ways these two icons approached fame, fans, and each other. When The Great Escape began filming in the early 60s, it was expected to be a monumental production, and it delivered. Packed with a powerhouse cast of rising and established stars, it had all the makings of a Hollywood classic. But while audiences were glued to the daring escape and charismatic performances, the dynamic behind the scenes was far more complicated, especially between James Garner and Charles Bronson. The set of The Great Escape wasn't your typical Hollywood party. It brought together strong personalities, each bringing their own reputation and ego to the table. Garner, known for his charm and laid-back professionalism, approached acting like a craft. He valued respect, teamwork, and focus. Bronson, on the other hand, carried himself with a much grittier edge. Reserved and often blunt, he wasn't interested in making friends, especially not in Hollywood. From the start, Bronson kept to himself. He wasn't rude, but he wasn't warm either. According to Garner, Bronson had a chip on his shoulder. He acted like he had something to prove, and perhaps he did. Bronson's tough upbringing and struggles to break into acting had shaped him into someone who didn't trust easily and didn't play the fame game. But that intensity made him difficult to work with. Garner saw it firsthand. Garner later recalled how Bronson would snap at crew members, criticize co-stars behind their backs, and isolate himself between takes. He wasn't the type to sit around joking or share meals with the cast. This didn't just make him distant, it made the energy on set tense. For someone like Garner, who thrived in collaborative environments, it was a drain. And while the two managed to get through the production professionally, the chemistry seen on screen didn't reflect the mood off camera. Their scenes together looked seamless, but the relationship was anything but. Garner kept his distance, while Bronson made no effort to bridge the gap. The coldness wasn't about one incident, it was an ongoing clash of personalities. One, a natural-born charmer with a deep respect for collaboration. The other, a hardened loner who saw vulnerability as weakness. Garner's frustration wasn't rooted in petty rivalry. It was about respect. He believed in treating everyone, cast, crew, even fans, with decency. Bronson, in his eyes, bulldozed through people, thinking his talent gave him permission to behave however he pleased. That rubbed Garner the wrong way, and he never forgot it. Still, for years, Garner kept those thoughts to himself. He didn't rant in interviews or lash out in tabloids. He remained silent until much later. And when he finally opened up about those days, it became clear the silence hadn't come from indifference. It came from deep disappointment. But Bronson's behavior on The Great Escape was just the beginning. Their dynamic would evolve even further as the years went on, and not necessarily for the better. James Garner and Charles Bronson were both veterans of Hollywood's golden age, but their values couldn't have been more different. On screen, they might have looked like two sides of the same coin. Tough, charismatic, masculine, but off-screen, their approach to work, fame, and life put them on a collision course. Garner came from a background of humility and mutual respect. Though he had his own tough upbringing, he never let it turn him bitter. Instead, he treated others with decency, whether they were co-stars or stagehands. He was outspoken when something wasn't right, but he wasn't cruel. His charm wasn't just for the camera, it was who he was. Bronson, by contrast, was guarded. His early years were marked by poverty and hardship, and he developed a lone wolf mindset to survive. Fame didn't soften him. If anything, it hardened his resolve to stay distant. Many saw him as intimidating, and some admired that. But for Garner, Bronson's coldness didn't come off as strength. It felt like disdain. The real turning point in their relationship came not through a single event, but a growing realization. Garner had worked with difficult actors before. Hollywood is full of big egos, but Bronson was different. He didn't just clash with others, he seemed to resent them. Garner saw it as unnecessary hostility, something that poisoned the atmosphere for everyone around. Over the years, Bronson's behavior became a topic of quiet conversation among cast and crew on various sets. People tiptoed around him, unsure what would set him off. Garner wasn't afraid of Bronson, but he also had no desire to deal with someone he saw as arrogant and unkind. The respect that typically formed between leading men never developed between them. Instead, there was silence, avoidance, and unresolved tension. This isn't to say Bronson didn't have his loyal supporters, he did. Some saw his behavior as a product of his past. Others believed he was simply misunderstood. But Garner wasn't buying that. To him, hardship wasn't an excuse for cruelty, and talent didn't excuse arrogance. As the years passed, Garner would work with dozens of other actors, many of them challenging in their own ways. But rarely did he speak about them with a kind of blunt criticism he later reserved for Bronson. That made his comments all the more striking. When Garner finally spoke out, fans were shocked, not just by what he said, but by how long he'd held it in. Their clash was more than a disagreement, it was a philosophical divide. One believed in kindness even in conflict. The other believed in keeping people at arm's length, no matter the cost. And while Garner walked away with respect from nearly everyone he worked with, Bronson's legacy would prove far more complicated, especially as stories began to emerge from others who had tried to work with him. James Garner wasn't alone in his experience with Charles Bronson. As time went on, more stories began to emerge from the shadows of Hollywood sets. Quiet murmurs from co-stars, directors, and crew who had worked with Bronson and found him, frankly, impossible to deal with. These weren't attention-seeking tales or dramatic tabloid fodder. They were offhand comments, casual admissions, and anecdotes that all pointed to the same truth. Working with Bronson was rarely easy. Behind the stoic persona Bronson wore, so well on screen, was a man who didn't believe in pleasantries. He wasn't interested in building friendships, and he didn't make efforts to hide his impatience with people who didn't meet his standards or simply got in his way. Some called him a perfectionist. Others called him cold. Garner, though, had another word for it: toxic. What made Bronson even more unpredictable was his disdain for the Hollywood system itself. While many actors leaned into the press tours, interviews, and award shows that came with stardom, Bronson recoiled from it all. He viewed the glitz as fake and the praise as hollow. That might have been admirable if it weren't for how it spilled into his treatment of the people around him. Multiple directors struggled to rein him in. He would sometimes refuse notes or challenge directorial decisions without discussion. He saw acting as a job, not a collaboration. And for co-stars who relied on mutual chemistry and communication, this became a major problem. James Garner, with his respect for the craft and his cooperative nature, found this mindset infuriating. He believed in showing up prepared, respecting everyone on set, and building a good product together. Bronson, in his eyes, saw only himself. Garner wasn't shy about saying that Bronson's difficult behavior created tension and slowed productions down. For Garner, this was more than a personality flaw, it was a lack of professionalism. But Hollywood, in many cases, let it slide. Bronson was a box office draw, particularly in the 1970s and early 80s. He sold the image of the silent tough guy, and audiences couldn't get enough. So even as rumors of difficult behavior persisted, studios kept hiring him. Fame, once again, proved to be a powerful shield. Still, reputations have a way of catching up. While Bronson's roles began to fade in his later years, Garner remained active, respected, and beloved both on and off screen. He was seen as a class act, the kind of actor others wanted to work with. Bronson, not so much. And as the spotlight began to dim on both their careers, the contrast in how they were remembered only grew sharper. But Bronson's behavior wasn't just about personality. It may have been rooted in something deeper, something that even he couldn't fully control. The tension between James Garner and Charles Bronson wasn't confined to film sets. One evening, shortly after filming The Great Escape, Garner hosted a casual poker game at his home. These gatherings were typically relaxed, offering a chance for actors to unwind and bond. However, this particular night took an unexpected turn. As the game progressed, the atmosphere grew tense. Bronson, known for his stoic demeanor, became increasingly confrontational. He challenged decisions, questioned others' plays, and his remarks grew sharper. What was meant to be a friendly game transformed into a battleground of egos. Garner, usually the epitome of patience, found himself pushed to his limits. The evening culminated in a heated exchange between the two actors. Words were said that couldn't be taken back, and the already strained relationship between Garner and Bronson reached a breaking point. This incident wasn't just about a card game. It was a manifestation of the underlying friction that had been building for years. The poker game became symbolic of their clashing personalities and differing worldviews. After that night, any remaining cordiality between Garner and Bronson dissipated. They maintained professionalism when required but avoided each other whenever possible. The poker game served as a turning point, solidifying a rift that would never heal. This event also highlighted a broader truth about Hollywood. Personal dynamics can significantly impact professional relationships. Even among seasoned actors, unresolved tensions can surface in unexpected ways, affecting collaborations and legacies alike. As time went on, Garner would occasionally allude to that fateful night, using it as an example of the challenges he faced in the industry. For him, the poker game was more than just a personal conflict. It was a lesson in the importance of mutual respect and understanding. And while the game ended, the repercussions of that evening echoed throughout their careers, serving as a cautionary tale of how personal grievances can overshadow professional achievements. For decades, James Garner stayed mostly silent about his tension with Charles Bronson. He wasn't the kind of man to air dirty laundry, especially not in public. But something changed as Garner got older. Maybe it was the freedom that came with age, or maybe he just got tired of pretending. Whatever the reason, he finally decided to tell the truth, his truth. In a rare and candid interview, Garner didn't hold back. When asked about difficult actors he'd worked with, he calmly but clearly brought up Bronson. He described him as antisocial and not someone you looked forward to seeing on set. But the real gut punch came when he said, without hesitation, he was just a bad guy. It wasn't said with bitterness, it was said with finality. For fans of both actors, this was a bombshell. Garner had built a reputation as a good-natured, classy guy. If he had something that strong to say, people took notice. The comment sparked online debates, articles, and revived interest in their rocky past. Some defended Bronson, citing his rough upbringing and deep privacy. Others applauded Garner for finally being honest. What made the moment so powerful was that Garner wasn't looking to capitalize on the drama. He didn't drag Bronson through the mud. He simply stated what he had experienced. And sometimes, truth spoken plainly hits the hardest. Interestingly, this wasn't the only time Garner had been candid about the darker sides of Hollywood. In his memoir, he talked openly about abuse he suffered as a child, unfair contracts, and even being punched by studio executives. So when he spoke about Bronson, it didn't feel like gossip. It felt like someone who'd seen it all and was done sugarcoating. Garner's words reignited questions about Bronson's legacy. Was his on-screen toughness just a mask for real-world cruelty? Or was he simply a misunderstood loner who didn't play the Hollywood game? Garner, for his part, didn't try to answer those questions. He left that to the audience. But one thing was clear: their relationship had never healed, and Garner never forgot the way he had been treated. Even with all his grace and charm, he couldn't forgive the way Bronson carried himself, and he wasn't afraid to say it anymore. And while Bronson's fans were quick to defend their hero, they couldn't ignore the fact that more than one Hollywood veteran had similar stories. But the real twist? Garner wasn't the only one who had something to say about Bronson, and the others had even more chilling accounts. As James Garner broke his silence, something strange started to happen. Other voices, ones that had been quiet for years, began to speak up too. Actors, stuntmen, even behind-the-scenes crew members started sharing their own stories about Charles Bronson. And the picture that began to form was far darker than most fans could have imagined. One former co-star described Bronson as intensely private to the point of paranoia. He reportedly wouldn't speak to anyone between takes, refused to rehearse, and would walk off set if someone questioned his choices. Others described instances where he'd erupt over minor inconveniences, changing a line, moving a prop, or being asked to do a second take. Then there were the darker allegations, moments of verbal abuse, threats, and emotional manipulation, all swept under the rug because Bronson was a bankable star. It wasn't just Garner who had felt the heat. It turned out many others were simply too afraid to speak while Bronson was alive, fearing backlash or being blacklisted in an industry that protected its biggest names. One particularly disturbing account came from a young actor who had a small role alongside Bronson in the 80s. He recalled a scene where he accidentally flubbed a line. Bronson allegedly didn't wait for the director to call cut. He stormed off set, called the actor a waste of space, and refused to return until the role was recast. The production gave in. The kid was fired. Bronson didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. What's shocking is that none of this ever made headlines at the time. Bronson's cold, hardened image gave him cover. People assumed he was just method or deeply in character. But as more stories leaked out, it became harder to explain away. The man audiences saw as the ultimate anti-hero may have simply been anti-everyone. Yet through all of this, Bronson's reputation as a Hollywood legend remained largely intact. That's the part Garner seemed most frustrated by. To him, Hollywood had created a myth around a man who didn't earn the admiration. While Bronson was idolized, the people who had been mistreated were expected to keep quiet and move on. It's a pattern that played out more than once in Hollywood's golden years, fame acting as a shield, even when the truth was right in front of everyone. Bronson, with his gravel-voiced intensity and no-nonsense attitude, became a symbol of toughness. But behind the scenes, that persona had a cost, and the people who paid it were the ones he worked with. And while Garner's comments sparked new conversations, they also raised a haunting question. Was Charles Bronson ever really acting? Or was the man you saw on screen just who he truly was? As the dust settled from James Garner's truth bomb and the wave of confessions that followed, one thing became glaringly clear: Charles Bronson's legacy was far more complicated than anyone wanted to admit. On paper, he was a box office powerhouse. He starred in over 90 films, became a global icon, and was one of the highest-paid actors of his time. But behind that legacy, a trail of fractured relationships, silence, and unresolved tension. Hollywood, in many ways, sculpted Bronson into a myth. He was the silent vigilante, the man who didn't flinch, didn't cry, and never begged for forgiveness. But that sculpted image came at a cost, one that men like James Garner were no longer willing to ignore. The myth might have sold millions of movie tickets, but it also buried the uncomfortable truth of what it was like to actually work with Bronson. Garner, in contrast, became a different kind of legend. Charming, self-aware, and generous both on and off the screen, he won over fans and colleagues alike. His legacy wasn't just built on what he did in front of the camera, but also on how he treated people behind it. And in many ways, that's what makes his comments about Bronson all the more devastating. Garner wasn't known for pettiness or exaggeration. If he said something was wrong, it probably was. Yet even in the face of these revelations, Bronson's fans remained fiercely loyal. To them, he's still the tough-as-nails everyman who stood up for justice when no one else would. They argue that he wasn't rude, just misunderstood. That he wasn't difficult, just private. And maybe to some extent, both truths can exist at once. But what makes this story even more compelling is what it says about celebrity culture itself. How many other legends are protected by the spotlight, their flaws polished away for public consumption? How many stories like Garner's were never told simply because no one had the courage or platform to speak up? Garner waited decades to say his piece. And when he finally did, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about tearing down Bronson's name. It was about making peace with the truth. His truth. The truth of what it felt like to stand next to a man who was celebrated by the world but made life hell for the people around him. And now, with Garner's words echoing across interviews, memoirs, and the internet, Bronson's legacy is being re-examined. Not erased, but seen through a clearer, more honest lens. But there was still one more twist in the story. Because as much as Garner had spoken out, he also hinted that there was something he never revealed. Even as James Garner peeled back the curtain on his experience with Charles Bronson, there was something in his tone, something unspoken, that hinted there was more to the story. He had no problem calling Bronson difficult. He admitted the man made filming miserable. But when pressed further in interviews, Garner would pause, deflect, or simply say, "There are things I'll take to the grave." It left fans and fellow actors wondering, what was he holding back? Some speculated it had to do with a specific incident that happened off-set, something never made public. Rumors swirled that during the filming of a now-forgotten project, Bronson crossed the line, not just with Garner, but with someone else in the cast. The tension was so thick, one crew member recalled, that the set atmosphere turned icy for the rest of the production. Garner, ever the professional, kept showing up and doing his job. But his demeanor changed, and he never worked with Bronson again. What exactly happened remains unclear. No one has ever gone on record with the full story. But Garner's refusal to speak on it, even after breaking his silence about so much else, speaks volumes. It wasn't just about being polite or keeping old Hollywood secrets. It felt more like a wound too deep to explain in a soundbite. And it wasn't just silence. Some of Garner's closest friends hinted that whatever occurred had stuck with him for years. In private conversations, he reportedly expressed deep disappointment, not just in Bronson, but in the industry for letting things slide. That frustration never quite left him. So why didn't he tell all? Some believe he simply didn't want to drag other people into the mess. Others think he was trying to protect someone else involved. But the most likely reason, Garner was a man of principles. He believed in speaking truth when it served a purpose, not just to satisfy public curiosity. And maybe in the end, his silence said more than any confession ever could. It suggested there were things about Charles Bronson that went far beyond being difficult or antisocial, things that could have changed the way people remembered him. But Garner, despite the tension, still gave Bronson that much dignity. This unspoken chapter has only fueled more speculation. Some fans have tried to connect dots across interviews, biographies, and behind-the-scenes gossip. But the truth, whatever it is, remains just out of reach. What we do know is this: the tension between these two men ran deeper than any Hollywood feud. It wasn't about ego or roles. It was personal. And while Garner gave the world a glimpse into that dynamic, he also reminded us that some truths are more powerful when left unsaid. But when one man's silence says so much, you can't help but wonder how much more there was to the story. In the aftermath of James Garner's revelations, it's hard to say what's more shocking, the truth about Charles Bronson's behavior or the fact that it took so long for anyone to speak up. Over the years, Bronson's tough guy persona had built him into an icon, a symbol of strength and resilience. But what was left behind when that image was peeled away? The truth is, as much as Hollywood and fans loved Bronson's on-screen intensity, the real man was far more complicated. He wasn't the kind of hero you could rely on to make the set run smoothly. He wasn't a man you'd want to grab a drink with after work. He was a loner, a private individual whose personal demons and rumored temper sometimes crossed the line. James Garner, on the other hand, had always been seen as the consummate professional, a man of charm and character who seemed to shine even in the face of adversity. His honesty about Bronson was a reminder of the often untold stories in the movie business, the ones that never make it into the glossy headlines or the curated images of Hollywood stars. For Garner, there was no desire for revenge, no need to expose Bronson's flaws for the sake of it. He simply stated the facts, shared his experience, and let the chips fall where they may. And in doing so, he not only spoke out for himself, but also for the countless others who never had a platform to share their own stories. When people look back on the careers of James Garner and Charles Bronson, it's not just their roles that come to mind. It's the lives they led, the choices they made behind the scenes, and the way their stories intersected in Hollywood. One man was beloved for his warmth and generosity. The other was adored for his stoic, unyielding persona, but beneath that armor, perhaps the truth was something far more complex. In the end, James Garner gave us more than just a peek behind the curtain. He gave us a glimpse into the heart of Hollywood, the kind of heart that sometimes beats fiercely, but often hides the scars it leaves behind. The legacy of Charles Bronson, for all his fame and accolades, will always be tied to his difficult nature. But it's Garner's words that have ensured his own legacy as one of the few who dared to tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. As for the relationship between the two men, well, maybe it's best summed up by Garner himself. In that same interview, when he was asked if he'd ever forgiven Bronson, he paused for a long time. Then, almost as if reflecting on a lifetime of experiences, he finally said, "I can't say I've forgiven him, but I've learned to move on." And in Hollywood, moving on often means finding your own peace, whether that's through reconciliation or simply accepting that some things are better left in the past.